Okay, so hello everyone, we are in Prague and today we are releasing DotVVM 2.0. My name is Tomas Herceg, I'm the founder of DotVVM project. I started coding the first commits into the repository 3 years ago, and today I'm very proud to show you the progress we have made in the last year with DotVVM 2.0. So in this presentation you will see new features and announcements about DotVVM 2.0 and also some new things which are waiting for you to try in DotVVM Business Pack. So stay tuned, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat in the video, and after this video ends I will go through all the questions and write some answers. So you won't get the response when I'm presenting, but after this session ends I will answer all the questions. And of course we are very interested in your feedback, so if you try DotVVM 2.0, let us know about your experience and share everything you think that might help us to deliver a better project. Okay, so let's start. Let's go directly to the presentation. So the first version of DotVVM came out in July 2016, which is almost 2 years. And after a couple of months, and it's exactly 1 year ago, DotVVM 1.1 came. It was in May 2017, so exactly 1 year behind. And DotVVM 1.1 brought a very interesting feature, which was the support of ASP.NET Core. .NET Core was quite new in that time, and there was a lot of things that weren't working quite well, but still we succeeded in delivering a version of DotVVM which is compatible with ASP.NET Core, as well as still it supports .NET Framework. After a few months, exactly in August 2017, we have released the first version of DotVVM Business Pack, which is not an open source, it's a commercial product, and DotVVM Business Pack delivers more than 20 enterprise-grade controls for building complicated line of business web applications. And today you will see some new things you can find in DotVVM Business Pack 2. And today, in May 2018, we are releasing DotVVM 2.0. The DotVVM team, which consists of about 20 people, has proved several times that we are not afraid of difficult tasks. Many projects can add a lot of new and small improvements, but to dig into the foundation of project and introduce support for a completely new platform or to change some paradigms, it's not so easy. And we had several milestones which enabled DotVVM with new possibilities. So first one, as I mentioned, was the support for ASP.NET Core. It was a new platform at that time. The tooling was still in preview. It wasn't 100% reliable and perfect, and a lot of things changed about the project system and things like that. And the platform had also only a restricted set of APIs, so the things we were using in DotVVM weren't available at that time in .NET Core. Now it's much better, and .NET Core is much more stable platform, and all the demos you will see will work also on .NET Framework, but I will show you the demos on .NET Core. Another big piece of work was the extension for Visual Studio, because there is not enough documentation for doing such level of customization of the product that we are doing, because we are extending the HTML editor, adding new controls, new bindings, extending the IntelliSense and things like that. So it was a very difficult task, but we succeeded, and we delivered also much simpler but still functional extension for Visual Studio Code. It's not written in .NET, it has to be written in TypeScript, but still it offers at least the basic IntelliSense. So if you are using Visual Studio Code, you can try this extension. And with DotVVM 2.0, we did have to do a fundamental change in the core of the framework, which was the system of data bindings. In DotVVM 2.0 there is completely new binding system which has a lot of extensibility points, so we can add a lot of new features, and some of them you will see in this video. And of course it's a great thing for the future because it will be much easier to add new features and new possibilities of all the controls and also the data bindings. Okay, so the first thing we have focused on with DotVVM 2.0 is the efficiency. As you know, sometimes if your page is too large and too complicated, sometimes the data transfers are killing the performance of the application. Because if you are using classic command binding, the page needs to serialize its view model and send it to the server. And if the view model has 100 kilobytes of data, then the request will be quite large. Of course, there are features like gzip compression on the HTTP level, so the real data is much less than the entire view model in JSON, but still it can be quite a significant amount of data being transferred just to call some tiny little function on the server and then returning back the results. So the view model is the entire view model goes from the client to the server if you are using command binding, and when the request is processed, only the changes go back, so it's not so bad on the way back because the server knows what's in the client view model and can send only the things that have been changed. But a lot of new features in DotVVM 2.0 is trying to make this more efficient. So that's the first few features we will be talking about, and the first one is REST API bindings, which allow you to call REST APIs directly from your DotVVM pages. And the second one are static command services, which allow quite similar principle, but it's not a REST API, it's your own code in your project. There is also a setting for buttons and controls which create postbacks. You can now work much easier with concurrent postbacks. So you can, for example, prevent the user to click the button twice and to create two records in the database. There have been also enhancements in single-page applications. If you have been using SPAs, you may noticed that in the URL there is the hash mark, and the relative path in the application is stored behind the hash mark. New browsers came with a thing which is called History API, which allows to have single-page applications without the hash marks. So we have implemented History API in SPAs in DotVVM, and it will work with very few changes in the code. You just enable this thing and it will start working. And the old links with the hash marks won't be broken because DotVVM will automatically redirect to a correct path. So even if you are linking to SPAs written in DotVVM from external applications, the links will still work even if you try this feature, if you turn this feature on. From the internal part, as I have already mentioned, there is the new binding system, and I will have a slide at the end of the presentation about what it exactly enabled us to do. There is also one new feature which gives you much better reusability of your controls, because now you can embed your markup controls in external DLLs and class libraries. So you can distribute the entire DotVVM controls or even pages in class libraries or on NuGet or other things. So you can easily share them across multiple projects, and you get the versioning if you are using NuGet or some other package manager solution. And there's a lot of tiny little new features, like a property called FormControls.Enabled, which allows you to enable or disable all the controls in a form at once without specifying enabled equals something for all the controls in the form. So it's much easier. And there is also a collection variable which will give you the information about the current item index in repeaters and grid views. So you will know if you're in the first row or if you're the odd or even row and things like that. So let's dig in those features in detail. So the first one is REST API bindings. The idea is behind this feature is to allow lighten the view models. So the view model doesn't have to include all the data. View model should persist the state of the page, but the data could come from elsewhere. So, for example, in your view model, you can have only the settings, for example, the paging, which column you are sorting by, and things like that, and load the data from the external source, for example, from the REST API. And if you are using HTTP GET, this could be cached. So, for example, if you have an application with 100 pages, and on every page there is a combo box with a list of countries, because it will go to the same URL and it's a plain HTTP GET request, which returns some JSON, this can be easily cached, so it can also cause a less load on the server. So it can be much more efficient, and also you don't need to transfer this collection in every view model in every page because it's loaded from an external source. The same can be applied, for example, for grid views and repeaters. You can easily load load data in these controls using REST API. And also you can invoke REST API methods from buttons. So, for example, you can create a button which calls HTTP post or HTTP delete or things like that. And when you load the data in the page, at some point you need to refresh them. So there is also a mechanism which allows you to refresh, for example, the grid view. If you change the filters and click apply filters, you need to call the REST request again and get the new fresh data. So there is a few ways how to do it. The first one is based on URLs. So if the grid view is loaded from some URL using HTTP GET, and you will post or put or delete or any other method on the same URL, this grid view will detect this and refresh automatically, because if you're following the REST conventions, whenever somebody posts or deletes from the same URL, the GET should reflect this change. And also there are a lot of there are two ways how to refresh this manually when you want. So you can say that you want to refresh this when some view model property changed. So, for example, if you change the date or change the year, that can cause the refresh of some REST API request. And also there is a manual way of triggering some event. You can create an event with some name, for example, refresh data, and a button can just trigger this event in the page. So any request which is bound to this event will get refreshed. So let's look at the code. I have a sample application here, and it's called Weekly Planner. So I will run it first, and it's quite simple task planning application. So you can see all the boxes for each day in the week, and the last one is extra for the tasks from next week. There is also a drag and drop control. It's implemented right here in the project, so you will be able to find this control and use it in your projects and see how it's implemented. You can take a task and drag it into another column. You can edit tasks, and every change goes through a REST API. There is practically nothing in the view model. So let's look how this works. So this is my Weekly Planner application. It's just one page. I have only one view here. And first, let's look in the view model. There is few things. First one is a property which persists the current date of the week which we are displaying. The second one is username, and there are two objects which represent the states of the model dialog which appears when I'm adding or editing a task. So basically there is one property with the description, and that's it. And also an indicator whether the model dialog is displayed or not. Yeah, so there is just the task. This collection is even not used, but there is also the text and created date and things like that. But that's a part of the model dialog. And then there is a sign-on method and nothing else. So adding tasks, editing tasks, deleting, and the drag and drops are done using different tools than the view model and using .vvm commands. Basically, they are calling a REST API. So let's look at the API. The good thing is that you can decide if the REST API is hosted in the same project or if it's a totally external application. Both scenarios are supported. In this case, I'm hosting the REST API directly in this project, but of course it can be separated in several projects. You can even consume REST API which is not under your control. Of course, then you need to trust that they won't change the API, and then the API will work. Okay, so here, if I open this controller, so this is the ASP.NET MVC Core controller, which returns JSONs. So here's, for example, the method getWeek. It gets the date, and it will return all the tasks in the week. It returns a collection of days, and in every day there is a task, a list of tasks, because multiple tasks can be in one day. Basically, every box here is the day. So I'm calling this getWeek method. It will return 8 objects, a collection of 8 objects, and every object can have another collection inside. So that's the tasks in this box. Okay. So also there is a create task, update task method, move task, which moves a specific task to another date, and mark the task as completed, and also delete task. I'm using the REST conventions, so this is HTTP delete, this is HTTP post, and like this, and so on. Okay, so that's the first thing. You have to build the API. There is also a new NuGet package which is called .vvm API Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core. .vvm needs Swagger metadata to be able to consume this API. And in .NET and .NET Core, there is a popular package called Swashbuckle, which you will install in the project, and it will generate the Swagger metadata of your API for you. So this is an extension for the Swashbuckle library, which is installed here, and it allows some tweaks how you can make the API to better suit .vvm. So what can be configured here? If you look in the startup, so I'm adding .vvm, and I'm also adding MVC because of the REST API, because of the controllers. And there are some options about the serialization. And now I'm configuring .vvm API options, and I'm saying options add known assembly, DVUDTO assembly. So I'm taking this type and getting this assembly of the type, and this tells .vvm and the REST API that it should share the types between the REST API and .vvm. If I didn't call this one, this row, this line, when .vvm generates the client for the API, it would use different objects. It would create its own objects. So I would have these classes in my project twice. So if you are using the API and .vvm in the same project, make sure that you add this assembly, the assembly which contains all the DTOs in this configuration, so the types can be shared. Otherwise, you will have 2 classes with the same name in different namespaces, and you couldn't share, for example, the validation attributes and things like that. So I'm configuring known assembly, and here in the Swagger generator, which is part of the Swashbuckle library, I call enable.vvm integration. This method will read this known assemblies and known types and it will make all the magic happen. And then I need to use .vvm command line. So if I open this folder and call a command line, I can say .net.vvm, and there is a command called api-create, and it has a few parameters, which is the URL to the Swagger metadata and paths to the my REST API classes. And if I run this, it will generate the clients based on the REST, based on the Swagger metadata. So I have already done this, and the exact syntax you can find it in the documentation. This .vvm command line tool generated these files. It generated API client CS, which is a C# client for the API, and it's just a class which has all the methods which are defined in the API, and it just composes the request and sends it to the server and returns the result, and handles all the serialization and deserialization for you. So that's the first client. The second client is this API client TS, which is a TypeScript version of the same client. These classes are the same, but written in different languages, but they are exactly the same. Even the methods, the types, everything is the same. So, and .vvm can use whichever of these classes to call this API. So that's the configuration. If the API changes, the configuration is stored here. So here is the configuration of the API client, and you can say .net.vvm API regen, and it will regenerate the clients. So these classes will be overwritten with the new versions, so it would match the API. And finally, in the .vvm startup, I can register my client. So I have set config register API client. This is the C# type. That's the URL. This is not the TypeScript, but the JavaScript. You have to compile the TypeScript into JavaScript, so .vvm can load this JavaScript. And this is the name which will be in the binding syntax, and in using this name, I will be able to call the methods. So whenever something is called _myAPI, it will give me an object which will contain all the methods from the API client, and I will be able to call the client. So that's how I register. And all those things I need to do only at the first time. Then I can just use the API. So let's look at the .vvm file, .vvm page, and I can see there is a repeater. And as you can see, there is a data source of the repeater is API tasks get. These generated names of the method, they can be changed. By default, it's generated from the URL. The URL is /API/tasks, and it's HTTP get. So the Swagger will compose this name, but you can rename it easily, quite easily. So I'm calling this method and passing the current date, and this will fill the repeater with all the days. So this will generate these boxes, because this API always returns eight entries in the collection. Always. And when the current date changes, I need to refresh the API, because when I click this, the current date is moved off by 7 days. So 7 days is added or subtracted from the value. So I need to call the API once again and get the fresh data. So that's why I'm wrapping this function in API refresh on change. And the first parameter is the API call, and the second parameter is the property which will be watched, and whenever its value changes, this API will be refreshed. And this returns the object, and there is a collection of days, which is the collection I'm binding to. So the .days is at the end of this expression. Yeah. So this is how I fill this repeater. And when we look down, there is another piece of the code. So here I'm using the draggable list. It's a custom control. It's implemented in this project. And basically, it's a repeater, but you can reorder items in the collection, and also you can move from one draggable list to another draggable list. Every draggable list is bound to a collection, and underneath, when you drag something from one collection to another, the object in the collection will be removed and added to the new collection. So this how this control works, but basically it's the same as repeater. It has item template, which is the content which is rendered for every item in the collection, and basically that's it. So let's look, for example, how marking the task as complete works. So when I go here and click the first task is completed, so this also calls an API. When I refresh the page, I run F5, you can see that this value is, the change is stored, is saved. So I have a link button here, which renders this checkbox, this icon, and on click I'm using static command and I'm calling an API method. So I'm saying API tasks complete by ID post. Also, again, it's a generated name from the Swagger. I was too lazy to rename it to something meaningful. I'm planning to, so watch the repository. It will be getting improved more and more. And this button will just call this request. So that's how it works. When I'm dragging, also this control has a static command bound to an event when I'm dropping the item into some collection. So when I drop the item, this API call will be invoked, and basically that's it. And another feature which is allowed in .vvm 2.0 is in static command is using the semicolon operator. So in the static command you can use multiple statements. So to display the dialog, for example, I'm setting add dialog is displayed, I'm setting the due date, I'm setting the text to an empty string, and setting the focus. We are of course aware that having 4 statements in the view is not a good practice. So in the next versions of .vvm you can of course expect that this could be in the view model, but we will be able to do this on the client side because nothing here requires to make the post back. And if there is nothing, no server dependency, this is translated to JavaScript. So this happens on the client side without any communication with the server. So this also makes everything much more efficient. And now we can have multiple statements here. Okay, so that's the first demo of REST API bindings. Let's go back to the presentation. There are some limitations in the .vvm 2.0. So not everything we planned can be done with REST API bindings right now. So the big feature I was expecting is to be able to return a GridView dataset from the API. Basically, you could send your sorting and paging settings to the REST API, and the API would return GridView dataset. So the GridView and data pager and everything would work. This requires deeper changes in the way how data pager and GridView work. We are thinking about adding some client mode or something like that, because right now the controls, the data in the controls are evaluated on the server, so all the command bindings can work and things like that. So this is planned for .vvm 2.1. Right now, GridView dataset is not supported. You can try to use it, but most probably there will be some issues. It requires, as I said, it requires deeper changes in built-in .vvm controls. But that's the way we are trying to go. Also, we need some feedback from you, so feel free to try REST API bindings and let us know what features would you like. We haven't dealt with many authentication scenarios yet, because right now we are assuming that you will have single sign-on between the .vvm and the API application. It's very easy if everything is in one project. It's quite easy to set up if everything is if it's 2 separate projects under your control. But for example, if you want to consume some external API, then you will need to work with the authentication. It can be done using JavaScript, but if many users will want us to implement, for example, the GitHub API or Twitter API or something like that, we can dig into this and make some feature right in the framework. Also, things like custom serialization. If the API is not under your control, sometimes it can return something that's very difficult to work with in the view model. We are interested in knowing such cases so we can add more features to make this easier to do. Also, the cross-origin resource sharing. If the API is running on different domain, there can be a lot of issues. It can be addressed if the course is set up correctly, but also maybe there is some feature which is missing from .vvm. So try it, please, and let us know. We are very interested in your feedback. So that was REST API bindings. Another feature of .vvm 2.0 is static command services. They have quite a lot of things in common with REST API bindings. And I think personally I like them more because they're more easy to use. You don't have to deal with the Swagger and things like that. Yes, these are two different ways of working, and every way has its pros and cons. So basically the feature works like that you register a service, which is a C# class, in the markup, and you can call methods on this service directly. So you are using static commands, so there is no transferring the view model to the server and back. You just send to the server which function you want to call, pass the parameters, and the server will return a return value. And you can assign this value to some property in the view model, so you can partially update the view model with the result of method you have been calling. Static command services support dependency injection, which is great. So you can then ask for another dependencies in the constructors and things like that. So it integrates with the ASP.NET Core or Oven pipeline quite well. Okay, so the difference between full postback using command binding and static command is that here in static command we are not transferring the view model. We are just calling a function, and we are only transferring the arguments of the server. Of course, if you will do _root, if you pass the entire view model as an argument, of course it will be transferred to the server, but typically you will pass just a few values and get the return value, which you can apply to the view model. So only the function name, which is of course secured, because we certainly don't want somebody to tamper with that, so it's protected, and all the arguments, and from the server you will get only the return value. If the function is void, the response will be just empty. So let's look at the demo of static command services. And okay, so that's in this project. So first, I'm using Entity Framework here, but it's not so interesting. So I have a class which is called Product Service, and that's my service. I want to call this service from my views. It's not a view model, it's just a service. It doesn't have to inherit something, implement something. It's just a pure C# class. In the constructor, I'm asking for Northwind context, and because it's registered in the service collection when this application starts, this can be provided. And also the product service is registered here in startup. So when anyone, including .vvm, needs an instance of product service, this infrastructure, the service provider, will be able to give .vvm this instance. So I have registered this service. It's registered as scoped, and thanks to this I don't need to dispose my context because this is also scoped. So when the request ends, everything will be disposed for me. This service has a function called load products, which can fill my dataset. I'm using Business Pack dataset, but it's only because I was too lazy to create my own CSS. So I use the Business Pack controls because they look nicer, but it would work exactly the same if this was a GridView dataset. So that's only for the better design because I'm really bad at CSS. Okay, so I'm just getting a queryable from the table, so I take the products table, and I'm building my objects which will load the category name and supplier name and things like that. And here I'm just passing this eQueryable to the load from queryable, which will detect all the paging and sorting settings from the dataset, and it will load the data for me. So it will adjust the query at the order by and skip take expressions to make everything work. There is another function, this is called getById, and it will get just the one product I have asked for. And there is also a function which allows me to reorder some products. So I'm saying which product I want to reorder and which quantity, and this will increment the units on order property of this object. So that's my service. And when I look in the page, there is a grid view. So this is a classic grid view with the products. So all the columns, it just displays the product. And there are two buttons in each row. One is trying to display a model dialog, which allows me to reorder this product, but it's using commands. And the second one does the same thing, but it uses the static command. Yeah, so there are two buttons. One is using command, one is using static command, and we will see how much data every button will transfer. So there is a first dialog, which is for the command button, and this dialog is displayed when product in the reorder dialog property is not null. The state of the dialog is represented in this reorder dialog view model, and there is just the information about the product which I'm displaying to the user and the quantity I want to reorder. So that's it. And this is the first dialog, so I'm displaying some information about the product, just displaying, and there is a text box so I can specify how much I want to reorder. And there is a button which is using classic command binding, and it's calling make order. Yeah, so it's classic command. There is a cancel order, so it will hide the dialog. And there is a second button, second dialog, sorry, and it does the same, but there are static commands. So we will see that I'm calling static commands here. Okay, let's run this app. So we will see how this works. So I will try to refresh that. So I'm sure that nothing is cached. Okay, so this is the list of products. And here are the two buttons I've been talking about. So the first one is using command. When I click this button, it has to take the entire view model, send it to the server, and there is something updated, so the dialog will appear. And when I want to order something, I'm ordering 10 items, so I click on make order, and there is another request. And in this console, I have written a piece of JavaScript that logs how many bytes I'm sending to the server and how many bytes I'm getting back. So this shows me that the view model has about 13 kilobytes. There is 50 rows in the table, so 13 kilobytes is not so much, but of course I'm just displaying a dialog. I don't want this data to be exchanged with the server. So now I'm doing the same thing using static command services. I will show you the code later, but it's exactly the same thing. And as you can see, when I order, as you can see, it just sends 480 bytes. In the first request, which shows the dialog, I'm getting 50 bytes back because I'm fetching the product by ID. So I'm fetching this row once again, so it contains the fresh data. And when I reorder something, it's 6 bytes because there is basically no return value. There is nothing that's empty response. Yeah, so this is much more efficient from the data transfers perspective, and the static command bindings are really powerful. Let's look at them. Okay, so at the top, I've registered my service. So product service equals, and here is the complete name of the type, including the namespace. So this is my product service. To make this work, the service must be registered in the service collection. So make sure that you register this in the startup, in ASP.NET Core or in .vvm startup in Owin. You will find the details in the documentation. But this has to be registered in the service collection, otherwise it won't work. Of course, you can bind this to your own IOCDI container. If you are using some, you can of course extend this functionality. Okay, so this is the product service, and in static commands I can now use the product service variable and call methods on my product service. So, for example, to display the dialog, I'm saying the root reorder dialog 2, which is the dialog for the static command version of the process, dot product equals product service get by ID, and I'm using the product ID which comes from the current row in the grid view. So I'm just taking the value from the grid view, product ID, and I will load using my static command service. I will load this entire object here. And because this dialog will be displayed when the product is not null, so when I load this product, this binding will be activated and the dialog will appear. When I set this back to null, then of course the dialog will be hidden. Okay, so that's displaying the dialog. So I'm just fetching the product DTO from the server, which is those 500 bytes and nothing more. And here in the save buttons, I'm calling product service reorder. I'm passing product ID and order quantity. So I'm reordering the product. And to hide the dialog, I have to say product equals null. I'm saying just product because I'm in the data context of the reorder dialog 2. And cancel button is easier because it's just product equals null, which will just hide the dialog and do nothing with the service. And these methods are defined on the service, so I can call them. But of course, it would be very insecure to allow anyone from the internet to call any function in my project. For example, they could call file.delete or something like that. So we don't want to allow this. So if you are calling any method from the views, you have to mark this method with allow static command attribute. So methods which don't have this attribute will not be allowed to be called. Of course, these parameters are not validated. It behaves like if you are writing a REST API, you are dealing the same situation. Yeah, the method is allowed because it's in the controller, but you cannot trust the user that the values of the arguments are safe. So you have to always validate the arguments. Here it's quite easy because product ID is validated across to the database. If it's not in the database, it will be null and it will return an exception. And the quantity, we just believe that the user won't try to overflow, but of course this should be checked. Yeah. So make sure that you are validating all the arguments. Anyone can just write a piece of JavaScript and send any values as the arguments. But he cannot call the method which is not decorated by allow static command. Yeah, so he won't be able to delete your files in your application or just list the web config and things like that. Okay, so that's the static command services. Again, there are some limitations which will be addressed in the next future. As I said, the fact that we have allowed semicolons in the static commands can lead to very large expressions in the buttons. So the static command will do 10 things. It's not a good practice. So there will be a way how to put these functions in the view models, but have them translated to the JavaScript. We are already working on that. Yeah, so that's the limitation, and the other limitation is that right now it's not possible to fill the grid view using the static command service. So you can have a function, for example, get products in the static command service and use it in the value binding in the grid view. The reason is the same as I was talking about in REST API bindings. The grid view requires the data to be loaded on the server because all the operations in the grid view and data pager are causing the classic commands. So that's why this requires deeper changes in these controls, so they could work independently on the server and everything could be done on the client, so we could avoid the command calls which are not efficient from the data transfer perspective. Okay, next feature is concurrency mode in postbacks. The thing that you have probably dealt with in .vvm 1. Anything was that if the user clicked the button multiple times, the postback occurred also multiple times, and if this was, for example, inserting data, it would insert two records in the database. So we have introduced a new property called postback.concurrency, which can change the behavior of the postbacks. By default, it's using the same behavior as was present in .vvm 1. Anything, and by the way, it's the same as the classic buttons in HTML. If you have a submit button in the page, you can also click it multiple times and it will do the same. .vvm didn't do anything to prevent this default behavior because it's also HTML default behavior. So that's how it worked. In .vvm, the command binding, if you are using the command binding in default mode, only the last postback will be applied to the page. If I click the button multiple times, only the last result will be applied to the page. The previous will be just lost. They will go to the server, they will be executed, but the response will be thrown away. Because it doesn't have to be current, because it could be changed by the next postback. So that's why .vvm throws all the responses and keeps only the last one. I will have a demo where this would be, where you could see the behavior. There is another mode which is great to prevent the double postbacks. It's called deny. So if a postback is running, this button won't fire another postback. It will wait until this postback finish. And the last mode is queue. It's good for low priority events, for example, some timers and refreshing every 10 seconds. Because if a user is making a postback and the timer will try to make a refresh, there will be a collision, so one of the postback results will be lost. So either the refresh won't happen, or the postback made by the user won't happen. So the user won't see the results of the action he made. So the queue is for these low priority postbacks like automatic refresh, and you can put this postback in the queue, so it will wait until the current postback is completed, and then it will be invoked. So let's look at the demo. Okay, I have another page here. Okay, so this is, I have added a short piece of JavaScript to make this more interactive. So let's refresh that to make sure that everything is working. And these buttons, they're calling just one method. So if we look at the source code, there are just 3 buttons. Every button has a different concurrency mode. So the first one is concurrency default, the second one is deny, and the third one is queue. And there is a repeater which displays just the items from the collection. And the postbacks are quite slow in the page. Maybe it's because I forgot this thread sleep here, but it allows us to see how this works. So I'm just sending the cargo, so I call send cargo with a unique index, and after 3 seconds this is added to the cargo's collection, and that's it. Yeah, but every postback takes 3 seconds because of the thread sleep. But I'm just trying to simulate some slower database communication or anything else. Okay, so I will push the button, and while there is some postback, I have a nice animation. So there's a car, and while the car is moving, there is a postback. Now you can see the postback finished, and the car appeared in the cargo's collection. Yeah, so I've placed number 1, and this is just a piece of CSS which is making this look like a truck. Okay, so that's the first postback. The next one will get the number 2 and things like that. Okay, so now what will happen when 2 or 3 postbacks at a time will be invoked? So I click once, twice, and third one. So you can see that 3 and 4 have not been added to this collection. DotVVM just thrown this response away, and only the last postback was applied. That's because it's a classic command. So the entire cargoes collection is sent to the server. So we could add 3, but it would disappear because the 4th and 5th car didn't have the 3 in the third one in the collection. So only the response of the last postback is applied. I will try it once again. So you can see the 6 and 7, they will be thrown away, and only the 8 will be applied. But on the server, of course, all of them were evaluated. Okay, so let's try the deny strategy. This was the default one, which is present in .vvm from the first version. Okay, so let's try deny. So I'm clicking, and we can see there is the postback interrupted message because I am in the debug mode. So I can see that the postback didn't happen because of something, validation broken or this deny mode. Yeah, so I can try it once again, and now I'm clicking and nothing happens. The postback cannot be invoked because there is another postback which is running. And now let's try the third strategy, the queue. So I can click once, and now I'm clicking twice and then the third time, and you can see it waits after the first and second postback is finished, and then it's evaluated. It's just put in the queue. So let's try it once again. So 1, 2, 3, and the 2 are waiting. Now it's 1 waiting, and now that's the last one. Yeah, so they're in the queue. So in your applications, you can easily, using the postback.concurrency, you can easily specify which strategy suits your needs. In many cases, the default strategy is good enough. A lot of applications was done in .vvm 1.1 where no other strategy was present. If you want to prevent the double postbacks, you can now use postback concurrency equals deny, which is very nice and very easy to use. So this should go to all save buttons or delete buttons, insert buttons, basically for all the buttons which manipulate with the data. And there is also the queue strategy, which is good for the background tasks or something like that. So if you written some JavaScript which refreshes the data once in 15 seconds, this should have the concurrency equals queue, because you don't want this background mechanism to tamper with current postbacks that the user could do. This also works on the static commands in the same way. The only difference is in the default binding, all the static command responses are applied to the page, because we are not sending the entire view model, so there shouldn't be so many collisions. If you fire several static commands and everyone is manipulating with different property, there shouldn't be any collision. So you can use this on the static commands too, and the deny strategy will work the same way how it works in commands. Okay, so that's the postback concurrency, and there are a few other features. So one of them is the collection variable. In the bindings, you can now use the underscore collection, and this will give you an information about the current record in the collection. It works only in the collection controls, so you can use it in the GridView or Repeater or controls like that. And there are properties called index, which is just zero-based index of the current item, and there are some helpers like is first, is odd, is even. We tried to add is last there, but it's more difficult to implement because we would need to access the collection and to know its size, which is quite easy in JavaScript, but it's not so easy on the C# because if you are using IEnumerable, we would have to go through all the entire collection, and it wouldn't be so efficient. So we haven't added is last, and we hope that we can live without that. Again, give us feedback if you really need the isLast, if you have a situation which cannot be solved without having the isLast, let us know and we will think about how this feature could be working. Okay, so that's the first feature. I will show a demo of it. So that's the first part of the page, the first column. You can see this is a table, and some cells are highlighted. And let's look at the code, how it's done. So I have a control here, and it's just a table which contains a repeater, and it has a collection of numbers. So there is a collection of numbers, it's just numbers from 0 to 9. It's a list of integers from 0 to 9, nothing else. And so in the first cell, I'm just displaying the current number. Yeah, so I'm using underscore this, so that's the integer which is part of the collection. And you can also use the underscore collection, which has the index property. So this is zero-based index of the collection. And there is also isFirst, isOdd, and isEven. I'm using class -active, which means that if this will be true, this cell will get the active class. If it's false, no class is applied. And this class will make the cell orange. So as you can see, these classes where the expression is true are orange. So even, odd, and isFirst, only the first row is true. The other ones are just false. And you can see the number is same, the index, because the numbers were also from 0 to 9. But the first is number, the second one is underscore collection dot index. So you can use this in repeaters and grid views everywhere you just want. So it's great for making these zebra colored rows or things like that. Okay. The other feature is FormControls.Enabled. If you have been building large forms, large complicated forms with dozens or maybe hundreds of fields, several tabs, and now the customer comes to you and say, okay, and if this is switched on, the entire form should be disabled, so nobody will be able to change any value in the form. And you say, okay, I need to get to all the controls and add something enabled equals and some crazy binding. So we have another solution for that, and that's called FormControls.Enabled. Okay? Okay, there's a problem with the screen, with the image. I will try to fix it. Okay, now it looks better. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so here is the next control. So it's quite easy form. There is data context set to address. So here I have an information about some company. By a coincidence, it's my company. And there is a property is in edit mode. And there is also a list of countries. So this is a helper. And this address object, that's the address. Okay, so here I'm setting this button. It just toggles the is in edit mode from true to false. So it just says static command is in edit mode equals not is in its edit mode. So it just toggles between true and false. And here I'm setting FormControls.Enabled equals this guy. And that's it. This will set enabled on all form controls inside. It doesn't matter if it's text box or combo box or checkbox. Also, all the business pack controls are supported. So this works with all form controls, and it will just globally disable them or enable them. For particular controls, you can override this behavior. So if you use the enabled, it will have the priority. So even if FormControls.Enabled is true, this will get priority and this would be able to disable the control. Or vice versa, if all the controls are disabled, you can still enable this control. So you are able to override this behavior. Okay, so this is the form. No enabled specified here, only at the last one. it's bound to the is company. So if it's company, the company number field will be enabled, otherwise it will be disabled. Okay, so let's go back to the demo. So we can see there is the edit button, that's the toggle button I've been talking about. So this toggles the is in edit mode property, and you can see that it enables and disables all the controls. You can make this larger so it's visible more clearly. Okay, so let's you can see it works, and this can be overridden. So this is still false because there is the enabled binding, but when I check this, it's also true. Yeah, so this enables you to globally enable or disable all the controls inside some element. In this case, form. You can see this is applied on a table. So this is applied on the entire table, so it works for all the controls in this element, and it can be overridden in cases where you need some exceptional, some non-standard behavior. Okay, so that's it. And the last feature is I will be talking about. There are more features in DotVVM 2.0, but this one I want to highlight. So the last one is embedding markup controls in DLL libraries. If you want to distribute some markup controls across multiple applications, now you can package them in class libraries and just reference them and use them in your application. So this control, the last control you have seen, is in a different project. I'm running this announcing.vvm.other-features project. That's the application. And this one, embedded controls, it's just a class library. You can see in the CS project that this is .NET standard, .NET Core library. It could be also .NET Standard. And we are referencing .vvm ASP.NET Core. Maybe .vvm would be just enough. I don't think we need the ASP.NET Core hosting infrastructure here, but whatever. It's just copied from the other project. That's the reason why this is here. And this control is set to embedded resource. So I have set build action as embedded resource. So this will be included in the DLL. And I have packaged all the view models and DTOs which the control needs together. Yeah, and everything including IntelliSense, it still works. And now in the .vvm startup, I need to reference this control. Of course, my project references this class library project, so it could see this control and the view models and things like that. And here I'm using a special format of URL which registers the control. So I'm using config markup add markup control, form control sample, and it's not a local path in the project. It's a URL starting with embedded. And the first part of the URL is name of the assembly. So that's the name of the project in which the control is hosted. And the second is name of the resource. Name of the resource is always composed from the namespace. So it's in the controls. So that's the controls here. And then the name of the file. So controls are not slash, just they are using dot. So controls dot and name of the control. Yeah. So that's the standard way how embedded resources are named. So this syntax is because how embedded resources work in .NET Framework and .NET Core. But still, this is the name of the assembly. This is the name of the resource, and that's it. Yeah. So this is the way how you can distribute your controls in multiple projects. Maybe you can also create NuGet packages, and you will get them versioned. So you can specify the version of the NuGet package in the CS proj, publish it, and if you update this control for one application, you will see in other applications that there is some new version of the control, which greatly improves the sharing experience between multiple projects. Okay? So that's the features which were present in .vvm 2.0. Now let's dig in .vvm Business Pack. So there is plenty of new stuff. Here's the summary of the most interesting features. So there are several new controls. One of them is calendar. So it's not just a date time picking control, but it's a calendar which you can use to render a full page calendar with events, and all the contents in the cells, they can be templated. So you will see you will see how this works. Also, there is a hierarchy repeater, which is a repeater which can render 3 structures. You will see how powerful it is if you know CSS. It's not my work. The guys from the team made that because I wouldn't be able to make that to work to look so beautiful. And there is a few other helper things like CopyButton and ToggleButton, which can simplify the some of the functionalities which you need to implement in your apps. Also, we are building a rich text box control, but we don't have a demo of it because currently there is still some work on it, so it's not part of the beta we will be releasing later today, but still in the future versions the rich text box will be there. There are some another enhancements. If you are building large forms, then you may find that using the default .vvm validation and specifying validator.value everywhere on every control, it might be quite difficult. So Business Pack has a better way how to work with validation, and it can emit these validation parameters for you automatically. There is also the AutoComplete control, which was present in the previous version of Business Pack, but now it can do a server-side search. So you will see how to connect it to server-side searching. And there is a new control on the grid view, which allows filtering on the columns. It's still in preview. We'll be adding more features, but it's available. The other area in Business Pack we have spent a lot of time was the design and look and feel of the controls. So the controls now look much more consistent, and I think personally that they're much nicer now. We have rewritten the client-side part from less to SCSS because I think we felt that less is quite dying, and all big projects moved from less to SCSS. So did we. And if you were not using the theme editor, but you were just overriding some default Business Pack CSS classes. So now in this version, the selectors are much simpler, so it's easier to override. And the icons are not using fonts, but they are using SVG, which is also a little bit better. .NET Core came with a few enhancements which allowed to run system.drawing on .NET Core, and also some libraries which we were using for exporting Excel files from grids. They didn't support .NET Core recently, but now they are. So these two features are available also on .NET Core. Previously they were available only in the .NET Framework version. So that's the new things in the .vvm Business Pack. Let's look at some demos. Okay, so that's the demo application of Business Pack. So, for example, I was talking about the calendar control. So that's the calendar control. By default, you can choose if you want to display a month, a year, or a decade. So that's one setting you can do. And also the contents of the cells can be templated, so you can render something like this. Yeah, you can see that there are multiple items in each cell because the cell can be templated. Let's look at the source, so you can see how this works. Okay, so yeah, so there's plenty of CSS, so this could look nice. And there is some glitch in the extension, so this is underscored, but it shouldn't be, and it won't be in the next release. And so you can see the first calendars. You can just select view mode, month, year, decade, and that's it. And this is the templatable calendar. You can template the day header, so that's the name of just the number, and also the day template, which will this was the name of the day, this column, and this is the day template, so I'm specifying the day number, and a repeater which can render all the events. And how to fill the data in this control? You will give it a data source with all the events from the all period, and then there is a binding which will say which property of this object can tell me in which day this event should be. So you will give this control the collection of 50 objects, and by this property, datetime, which is present in the objects, this calendar will sort it out in which cell this event should go. Yeah, so this is the way how you can work with data in this control, and you can use any template you want. So that's a new control, and I think it will be quite popular because writing the logic for rendering the correct days and days in the week and things like that, it's not so easy. So this might help a lot of people to address this issue. Okay, so let's dig to another control. This is a hierarchy repeater. It's a repeater which can deal with collections. And if you know CSS better than I, you can do something like this. So this is just a hierarchy of controls, but thanks to CSS, which are rendering these lines, this looks like a tree. So that's for me, it's a magic, but that's what you can achieve with this control. If you look at the source code, hierarchy repeater, it's also quite simple. This is the CSS, that's the magic happening. And that's the hierarchy repeater itself. You will just set name of the text. So this is the UL and this is LI. So that's basically a multi-level HTML list. And you just specify the data source and item children binding. So the control can detect which children it should render for every node. And this is the template used inside. So that's just the text. Yeah, so this in HTML, this is just an unordered list. Yeah, UL with LI. And there is another UL and LI inside. Yeah, that's just multi-level list. And thanks to CSS, it looks like this. So that's magic for me, but that's what the hierarchy repeater can render, the multi-level lists. Another very useful and very simple control is CopyButton. So you can just generate some GUID or some password or something like that, and then just click on this control and it's in the clipboard. It's very easy to use. So here is the CopyButton, and you just bind the value. You just bind the value to copy to a view model property, and when the user clicks the button, the value will be copied to the clipboard. So it's very, very easy, very simple to use. Okay, so that's the new controls. There are a few more of them, but I don't have demos for all of them because it would be a very long session. Okay, let's look at automatic validation. Let's look at the code first. So that's the validation, and here's a form. So there is a name, email, birthday, gender, and things like that. If I was using a classic validation, I would have to say validator.value equals and the same property. Because this is just for displaying the data, and this is for validation. And this doesn't have to be same in all cases, but in 99.9% cases it is the same. So automatic validation can be turned on the form or on any other parent element. So I'm saying allow auto validation, and it will generate this validator.value automatically for all Business Pack controls. So if you are building the forms using solely Business Pack controls, you can use this. Of course, you can set another options for that. And if you are using validator.css class, this class won't override the default classes on the Business Pack controls. So they will still look nice, and you can apply your own class and specify some other CSS properties to apply on controls which are not valid. So this is quite nice to use. Also, there you can see a preview of new datetime picker. It's a very complicated control. It may look like very simple calendar, but the amount of work spent on Data Picker to be reliable was very high, and we have did a lot of refactoring of this control, so it could be more maintainable. So that's a new version of Data Picker which is present in Business Pack 2.0. Okay, so that's it. That's automatic validation. There is also an autocomplete control which can search on the server. You just specify a function which can be a command or a static command. I recommend static commands because you don't want to transfer the entire view model to the server and back just to get few suggestions for the search. So I recommend static command, and it works well with static command services. So there is a function load items, and you can just say static command, and it's a delegate, and again there is a glitch in the extension. It doesn't support this new syntax, but there is a parameter, and this is not a variable, this is just given by the control. So that's supplied by the control, and you can also pass any other parameter. So that's it, and it will provide a list of items for me. So if I look in the view model, there is a function called load repositories. There is allow static command. You can see that it can be async, and I'm using GitHub API to search for GitHub repositories. So if this doesn't work, it means that I have exceeded the limit, the rate limit, because the GitHub API is quite restrictive in terms of rate limiting. Okay, so now it works. So you can see that it can search the GitHub for me, and it's using static commands. So it's not very difficult and not intensive in case of data transfers. Okay, so the last demo I have here is a grid view. So there is a new control for filtering the grid view, and it's called FilterBuilder. And you can decide the strategy if you want is equal, contains, ends with, starts with, and blah blah blah. There is also a special behavior for collections, because this is basically some list of items, or table of categories. It has about 10 records. So you can create also a drop-down list here, so the user can select from this category, yeah, and the filtering now works. Yeah, so that's it. And also there is some special behavior on numbers. Yeah, you can see there is a numeric up-down control used. So that's also quite useful and convenient for the user. Of course, there are some columns you don't want to filter, so you can just don't enable the filtering on the column. By default, it's switched off. You have to opt in on every column to make the filtering available. It works the same way as sorting and other features. They also have to be opted in. Okay, so that's what's new in DotVVM Business Pack. And if you visit the .vvm.com website, you can now apply for a trial version of a Business Pack. Previously, we have offered a trial version, which was some old beta version of Business Pack. Now we have a proper trial version, so you can go and apply for a trial version of Business Pack. And of course, we'll be also interested in your feedback. So try those controls and let us know what you think, what suggestions, what new features would you appreciate. So that's a summary of the controls. So there is the calendar, which can be templated, and it works as a basis for new editors we are making. So the Data Picker and other controls, they are using the calendar. There is a hierarchy repeater for rendering multi-level lists or other hierarchical structures. And there is few other buttons like drop-down button, which you could see in the filtering, because when you click a filter icon, it's basically a drop-down button. There is copy button, there is toggle button, and again a lot of other controls. Okay, so that was .vvm Business Pack, and there is a very short section about .vvm internals. I was talking about new binding system, which took us a lot of time to implement. Basically, we had to refactor or rewrite fundamental parts of .vvm framework to provide much better extensibility. In the previous versions, when we get the binding expression and when we needed to render some JavaScript views, we were just concatenating strings. Now we are building a JavaScript syntax tree which gets translated to the JavaScript. If you are curious how the syntax tree works, you can look at the weekly planner demo. It's on the GitHub, and there is a nice function, a class called JavaScript translators, and here you can specify a JavaScript equivalent of C# functions. So I'm using datetime at days in static commands, and I've provided .vvm with a translation, so it can translate datetime.addDays. And as you can see, I'm building a JS binary expression with some assignments, and then I'm creating a new date object with all these methods. So that's how we can represent pieces of JavaScript, and this tree can be serialized in valid JavaScript syntax, and it will handle all the things like knockout observables and things we are dealing with in .vvm in the client side. So it's much easier than building just pieces of strings because of the parentheses and all these syntax features of JavaScript language. So that's the JavaScript AST, which is part of the new binding system, and every data binding can be translated that is translated in JavaScript is using this ASTs. Also, internally, we now support dependency injection in controls. Also, in a markup control, you can use dependency injection and inject your services so the control can work with data of the application and things like that. And also, internally, this allows us to introduce very interesting features that wouldn't be available without this mechanism. The biggest advantage for me is the extensibility, because all the things you have seen that I have registered a REST API client as a variable which is allowed to use in the data bindings, or the static command services was registered so it could be used in the data bindings, or the underscore collection variables. These all are extensions of the new binding system. You can, on every place, you can add a special variable and tell .vvm how that could be translated in JavaScript. So that's the extensibility we now have, and which will allow us to deliver more and better features. Another part, which is also quite good, but basically internally, is the type inference. In previous versions of .vvm, we weren't able to figure out the result type of the data binding. We had to evaluate the binding and look at the result, but we didn't. It was strongly typed, but there was no way how to get the result value at the compile time. And so we are using now, we have the type inference. So if you're, for example, if you are using the text box with datetime or integer values in .vvm 1.1, you had to specify value type equals number or value type equals datetime. Now it's not necessary, because we can figure out the type of the binding by ourselves. And there is a lot of new ways, new usages of this mechanism. So that's also a benefit of the new binding system. That's also the reason why .vvm 2.0 took so long to release, because this was a huge amount of work, but it was very useful for us, because these new features I have shown you wouldn't be possible without this binding system. So that's great stuff. Okay, so let's look at the future, what's coming. We have built controls which help to build complicated layouts in a web application. They are using CSS Flex. I think that we will add the option to use CSS Grid in the future, but these controls are almost almost done. We are just building a documentation for them, and this will be a new product which you will be able to use. It won't be so expensive because basically it's a few controls, but they come with a layout framework which will allow you to easily build complicated layouts, including responsivity and all the things that are needed. Also, Bootstrap 4 was finally released a few months ago, and we are working on providing support for Bootstrap 4 in our Bootstrap 4.vvm controls. And it will be included in the licenses you already have. So if you bought Bootstrap 4.vvm, you will get the support for the version 4 soon enough and for free. So that's great. They are not sold separately, it's together. If you buy a license, you will get both versions for Bootstrap 3 and Bootstrap 4. There is new things coming also to a Visual Studio extension for .vvm. You may have noticed that some features were appearing. One important thing, make sure that you are running the last version of Visual Studio. If there is the yellow flag on the top of the Visual Studio, make sure you are running the latest version. Microsoft is changing some APIs in the HTML editor with every other release, so we need to update this extension to make sure it works in the latest version, and the support for the latest version is a priority for us. So make sure you are running this version and you will be getting the new features. In the future, we will be adding more features about code generation and scaffolding. Right now, you can try if you write a binding with a property which doesn't exist, and there will be the light bulb which will appear, and it will allow you to generate the property in the view model. Yeah, so that's one of the code generation features, but there will be more features coming. If you will bind a data source to a grid view and you will already have it declared in the view model, we will be able to generate the grid view columns for you using some automated logic, and you will just delete those you don't want to have, and so on. So there will be more things coming. There is also a diagnostic window which will allow you to diagnose how much data is transferred on every post back and things like that. So that's new features coming to .vvm for Visual Studio. And currently we are experimenting with a lot of other interesting areas, like integration with other frameworks, for example React. If you want to use some React controls in .vvm, it's currently possible. If you visit the .vvm contrib repository, you can try React Bridge control, and for example, there is a lot of nice chart controls for rendering a lot of things, and these chart controls with tons of features, they are using React. So you can, using React Bridge, you can use these controls in .vvm application, load data from the view model, and pass that data to these controls, and if the user changes something in the control, you can propagate this change to the view model. So it's integrated with the view model, and you will just, in the C#, you will just get the data, pass it to the view model, and the React Bridge will give this data to the control. Also, we are playing with WebAssembly. Maybe you have heard about the Blazor project in Microsoft. They are trying to make the complete rendering on the client. So this would allow to write application in C# without server part, and it would run in a browser. Currently, there are still problems with some browsers which don't support WebAssembly, or where the support doesn't work. For example, in Safari, there are some problems with WebAssembly right now, and there is constant fear that these applications will be so large because you have to take the .NET runtime and deliver it to the client side, so it can be few megabytes of libraries. In .vvm, we don't want to render everything on the client side. It was an experiment we did, and we succeeded, but still we don't think it's had such a huge benefit. But for example, if similarly, like we have static command services, if we could have WebAssembly services which would allow to call a function from a WebAssembly, maybe from any language, not just from C#, and to run some workload on the client and integrate it with the view model, so it could read the values from the view model and it could put the results in the view model. Also, we have been thinking about replacing Knockout.js with React, because if the page is too complicated, if there's thousands of rows in the grid, the knockout can be quite slow. So we were thinking about integration with React, and we have built a prototype where the data bindings are translated and the page is translated to React, and there is still Knockout.js running in the background, so all the controls which are using Knockout.js can still work, and there is a compatibility layer between these two technologies. We don't know yet if this is the future of .vvm. This is the things we are playing with. So if you have another ideas or another feedback, also feel free to contact us in the chat or on the Gitter or via any other channel. So that's the roadmap for the future. That's the experiments we are playing with. Also, we will be adding more features to REST API bindings and static command services, so they could work with the GridView and data pager more smoothly, and with the data sets and stuff like that. So this will be part of the next release of .vvm for sure. Okay, so that's it. Finally, I would like to invite you to a conference we are organizing in Prague in November. There will be few very known and famous people like Carl Franklin, Richard Campbell, Julie Lerman, and these people will talk on this conference in Prague, and also the entire .vvm team will be there. There will be some .vvm focused workshops. So if you are from Europe and you want to meet the guys from the .vvm team, make sure to come to this conference, so you can chat with us, have a beer with us, and ask anything you want to know about .vvm. So that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us on Gitter and follow us on our social networks on Facebook or on Twitter, so you won't miss any news we are doing with .vvm. .vvm 2.0 was just published to the official Nugget, so you can download it and tell us what you think. There is an upgrade guide in the documentation, so if you open .vvm website, go to the documentation, there is a page upgrading to .vvm 2.0. There was a few breaking changes. The only breaking change was in the startup CS. It's moving one Lambda function into .vvm startup, so it should be a matter of 1 or 2 minutes in a project. So it's very easy to upgrade. Please do that and let us know, so we can make .vvm better and better. Okay, thank you for watching, and I will go through all the questions in the chat and write answers there. So see you next time. Bye.